Portraiture, perhaps the most human interaction you'll have when taking photos, and definitely the most collaborative genre of photography out there. With portraits, there's always someone involved, the person you're photographing. As such, there's a lot of dimensions around what good portraiture could be and what it might mean for you. Ultimately, it's about taking photos of people, but the purpose for that could be about many things. It could be about the emotion of the person. It could be about the environment that they're in. It could be about the clothes that they're wearing or the makeup that they have on. It could be about form and shape and dynamic movement, or it could be about static and, the stern kind of looks you get in a headshot. Now, in most cases, a portrait aims to tell you something. And the context to which you're viewing the photo and the context to which it's being presented really matter, and it really changes the way you as the viewer perceive the photo. And in that way, it's a lot more direct than other genres of photography. Now, because of all this variance, there are many different offshoots and subcategories of portraiture, and we'll definitely cover a lot of them today so that we can start to get a better understanding of what exists out there in the world, why people do it, and then how we can replicate those for ourselves as well. But first, what makes a portrait a portrait? Well, at a fundamental level, a portrait is a photo of someone. But that doesn't specifically define how much of that person needs to be in frame, or what they need to be doing, or what they need to be wearing, or anything like that. It just suggests that for it to be a portrait, it just needs to be a photo of someone. Similar to the open definition that I have of street photography, I think that having a very broad definition of what a portrait is really useful, because then we can open ourselves to the possibility of all of the other wonderful subgenres within the portrait genre and learn all of the amazing skills in this space, because why limit ourselves, right? Now, one of the reasons why there are so many things to learn here in portraiture is because, as humans, we have been obsessed with the idea of documenting our fellow humans for as long as we have been recording history, pretty much. Portraiture is the oldest genre within photography for sure. And it's one of the oldest art forms just in general. I mean, if you think back to the cave paintings and Egyptian hieroglyphs and, then to traditional paintings and experiments in representation of people over time, it's very human to want to express the likeness of another human. And we've been doing it forever. So, of course, there are many different meanings, uses, and associations with the many methods that we've used to represent humans over time. In the modern day era, especially as it pertains to photography, though, there are many, many reasons why portrait photography specifically is alluring. There are some people who really love to shoot in a studio setting and being able to control all of the variables and use flashes and so on. And there are people who love it for being able to show off outfits and clothes or fantastic makeup and hair. And there are some people who love the interaction that you have with the model or the person you're photographing and love the connection and the people side of things. There are some people who love directing and, directing poses, and they are really good at it. And some people can become addicted to the emotional expression that, is created when two people really collaborate together. There's something special there. Other people love taking care of their own stuff and making sure that the context is great while the model makes sure that they've got their poses down. There are so many different reasons that you might love doing portraiture, and no one reason is more correct than another. It's completely up to you. When it comes to how to take portraiture shots, there's a few considerations to make, and most of them surround shutter speed, lighting, and depth of field. At a simple level, your shutter speed needs to be fast enough to freeze the motion. Your lighting needs to be intentional enough so that you can shape the kind of light you would like to see in the face, especially if you are shooting in a studio environment. And if you want bonus points, then adding a shallow depth of field may enhance the story that you're trying to tell with the image as well. So let's dig into each one of those points individually. Now, similar to street photography, we're photographing people. So we need shutter speeds and autofocus modes that are suitable for that kind of shooting. However, unlike street photography, the subjects in our portraits can actually have the potential to move quite a bit faster in our compositions because they quite literally take up more of the frame. Not only that, but you as a human, well, you move. And the subject that you're shooting is also a human, and they also move as well. So that means we need to fight both camera shake and another human moving in potentially erratic motions. And thankfully, again, we can start from a decent place of 1/400th of a second and just, begin to adjust from there depending on what types of portraits we're doing. As always, I feel a lot safer shooting at 1/1000th of a second, but again, experiment because your results may vary. Now, obviously, if you have a more telephoto focal length, then you'll need to increase your shutter speed even more, as we've already mentioned in the past. And also remember that no shutter speed is ever too high, so long as you have the space to move in the exposure triangle. Now, one thing that I did want to cover when it comes to shutter speed specifically, though, is the use of flash. In portraiture, there are many subgenres that can be shot quite often in studio settings. And oftentimes in studio settings, portrait photographers will actually use flashes in their work. Now, these lights quite literally flash a very large light at the subject in a very intense manner, but that's how the subject is lit in some instances. Now, because this is a fundamentals course, we won't be teaching flash usage because it can get quite complicated and quite advanced pretty quickly, especially when we're talking about things like flash output, sync speeds, beam angles, and all the other bits of gear and accessories that go with it. But I did want to mention that shutter speed and flash gets very technical very quickly, and most shutter speed rules go out the window almost immediately when you are using flash. For example, for non-high speed sync cameras, while a flash can burst light extremely quickly, like 1/1000th of a second and above, most cameras, when synced to it, can only shoot about 1/50th of a second. Now, there are high speed sync configurations that allow you to go up to, 1/8000th of a second, but getting the right setup for all the pieces to work is a lot of research and a lot of money. But why I mentioned flash in the first place in particular is because the idea of using a flash and shutter speed together is really about the idea of exposing for the background of a shot and then using something to fill in the front of the shot in terms of lighting. And you want to be able to have both the subject and the scene illuminated enough so that you can see both of those things, and that's what a flash is good for. Alrighty, with all that flash talk, that's a great segue into the next thing, which is lighting. Portraiture, perhaps more so than any other genre of photography, has a lot of attention to detail when it comes to lighting. While every genre of photography is inherently about the capture of light, in portraiture, shaping that light is very important and can have a lot of different effects on how the portrait ends up looking. Now, these techniques that I'm about to show you are much easier to achieve in a studio setting where you're able to control the intensity and the direction of a light with artificial lights, but that's not to say that you can't do this in natural light outside as well. You most certainly can, but you have to be a little bit more attentive to where the light is coming from so that you know how to shape and mold it to your liking, and your model will probably have to adjust their angles with your direction as well. Now, in terms of that light source, in general, it's always a better idea to have a very large, diffuse light source like a light box or a softbox or a scrim, rather than just having a very direct and intense light. Intense light never looks flattering on anyone, so when you are looking for light or when you're trying to cast a light, try to make sure that it has a large surface area so it doesn't look that obvious that the light is on the subject. Even using simple things like baking paper or a sheet in front of a really bright, intense light source will look exponentially better than using a direct light source. Something to think about. Okay, let's talk about shaping the light. When we talk about shaping light, we're talking about controlling the direction of the light source itself. Different directions cause different effects to occur, and we'll go into some common examples of this now, but note that these examples are all about how to shape the light on the face rather than talking about the intensity of the light itself. Let's start with the easiest to understand in my opinion, flat lighting. Flat lighting, also called butterfly lighting, is where you have the light source coming in directly behind the camera, parallel to the subject, but just slightly above the camera, usually slightly above the subject in terms of height, but also as flat and as parallel as you can get it. Now, this style of lighting will illuminate the entire face and show all of the details of the face. And this style of lighting, if done with a large diffuser light like a softbox, can look really nice with even light and soft shadows under the cheeks and the chin. It's great for beauty and makeup style photography because it shows off the face really well. However, it doesn't have a lot of contrast and the contour can look quite flat. So it's most well suited to slim faces with defined features and may not look flattering for everyone else. This is perhaps the most common and popular style of lighting, and it's actually the one that I'm filming this course with right now. Loop lighting is where you have the light source at around 45 degrees to the left or the right of the subject, keeping the light just above eye level with the light facing down a little bit as well. Now, the effect of the lighting being placed in this way gives off a very soft, subtle shadow on the opposite cheek with a darker shadow fall off on the chin on the opposite side like I have here right now. And this kind of shadow detail really shapes the face and will look flattering on just about anyone. And in my opinion, the shadow is the perfect amount of drama and contrast to make your subject look good with this style of lighting. Of course, I can't talk about lighting without mentioning the legendary Rembrandt lighting. This is a style that was very commonly used in the portraits done by the namesake Dutch painter. This lighting style is very similar to loop lighting, but on just a little bit more of an angle, perhaps around 50 to 60 or so degrees to the left or the right of the subject. Placing the light in this way gives off the characteristic and distinctive triangle of light on the opposite cheek, which is cast from the nose and joins the high point of the cheekbone. It's a super moody type of lighting style and can really help shape the face because how the shadow falls off the opposite side of the light. It's flattering on most people, but it can be tricky to set up and a little bit finicky depending on the pose that your model is trying to go for. Regardless, it is a very pretty lighting style in my opinion. So we started front on with butterfly lighting, and then we moved a little bit to the side with loop lighting, and then a little bit more to the side with Rembrandt lighting. And now we have split lighting, which is where the light is placed directly 90 degrees from the subject, so literally on one of their sides. Now it's called split lighting because of the effect that it has on the face. One side of it is bright and well lit, and the other side is completely in shadow. And done correctly, the line will be directly in the middle of their faces down the nose, causing an extreme contrast of brightness and shadow. Now, this creates a very dramatic, moody, and mysterious vibe, especially since only one of the subject's eyes will really be visible. And to round things out here, if we place the light source directly behind the subject and a little bit lower so that the subject's head is in between the light and the camera, this is called backlighting or hair lighting or rim lighting, as it has the effect of lighting the back of the head and thus the edges of the hair. Now keep in mind that if you don't have a fill light to the close side of the camera, you won't be able to see your subject and they will be a silhouette. However, if this is what you are going for, then it can look interesting. All right, so all of those different lighting techniques, butterfly lighting, loop lighting, Rembrandt, split, rim, all of those different lighting techniques assume that you're using one singular light. And this one main light is called the key light, and it's in the name. It's the key light that is shaping your lighting and thus your portrait. However, if you're looking for a more balanced exposure, you can include fill lights into the scene to help illuminate your subject from different and usually contrasting angles to help them stand out a little bit more or be able to see the details that were once in shadow. For example, it's not uncommon to see loop lighting with a very dim rim light and perhaps a fill light off to the opposite side as well. And this is exactly what I've got going on right now in the scene, and it causes a dimensionality with the light. You get the shadows that are creating this shape, but they're also not so dark that they're completely moody. Having more lights doesn't inherently make the image better. It's all just about what you're intending to do with the image and how you want to convey the mood and the vibe that you are trying to go for. And remember, as always, intentionality is key. All right, let's talk about bokeh. So, shallow depth of field and bokeh aren't actually the same things, although some people do tend to use them interchangeably in this kind of context. But shallow depth of field actually refers to a very small amount of depth of field, usually razor thin, and this means that only a very tiny portion of the image is actually going to be properly in focus, and the rest of it is going to be out of focus, which is what bokeh is. Having a shallow depth of field allows you as the photographer to tell the viewer of the image what the important part of the image is. Whatever is in focus is important. Whatever is out of focus is not important. The focus portions have the highest amount of visual hierarchy, so the viewer will look at that area first. In portraiture, we use a very shallow depth of field, usually focused at the eyes, because the eyes are what drive the story in a portrait, and they're what we as humans look at when we first see an image of another human. Just like in real life, when you talk to someone, the first thing you do is you look them in the eye. And it's for this reason that many photographers, many portrait photographers, myself included, we throw away shots if the focus doesn't hit the eyes and the eyes aren't properly in focus. You know, for me, and I'm not alone here, if the eyes aren't in focus, then the image isn't usable. As plain and as simple as that. I would never, ever, ever show an image to the public of a portrait that doesn't have the eyes, or at least the lead eye, in focus. It's just an absolute no-no for me and for many other portrait photographers too. It's that important. When using a really fast lens like f1.4 or f1.2, just be aware that in some cases, the depth of field can be so shallow that the distance between the iris of the eye and the eyelash of the eye can mean the difference between it being in focus and not. You can sometimes have this issue with autofocus cameras sometimes where they'll accidentally focus a little bit too forward or a little bit too far back and you'll miss the iris. Now, when you're experimenting with this kind of shallow depth of field, this is just something to watch out for and be cognizant of. Now, you could do this via manual focus if you're a masochist, but I tell you, right, like it's really, really hard to shoot people with razor thin shallow depth of field, like 1 or 2 millimeters. It is almost impossible to reliably hit focus and hit the iris unless you're both standing super, super still for an extended period of time. And even then, it's very difficult still. And this is where autofocus it can't be beat. Now, if the portrait is about more things than just the face or the eyes, let's say it's about the outfit that the model is wearing as well, then depending on the plane of focus you're working with and what pose the model is having, we may need to increase our depth of field so that it includes more than just the model's eyes, but it also includes the clothes in focus as well. This is very commonly the case in fashion photography. You know, in those kind of scenarios, depending on the focal length and the distance away from the subject, it's not uncommon to see apertures of f1.8 or f2.8 to ensure that the subject and the entirety of what they're wearing is still in focus. Alrighty, let's talk about gear, because there's a lot of it. The gear revolves around 3 main things: lighting, shallow depth of field, and autofocus. So let's dive into each one of those things as it relates to gear in portraiture. So in the previous section, I mentioned that there were different ways to light our subjects, but we didn't really speak about the types of lights that we can do that with in a studio setting. Now, of course, if you're just outside shooting natural light, this section won't really apply to you, as you can just try to find the light that you like outside wherever you can. However, when you want the ultimate control, usually in a studio, then we need to get a little bit more specific. So generally, when it comes to studio lights, there are 2 main things to consider. What is the light source, and what is the kind of light modifier on that source? Usually the light source is going to be too bright and too harsh on its own when used directly on a subject's face. So usually they require a light modifier in order to reflect or diffuse the light so that it looks softer, more even, and thus more flattering on the subject's face. In terms of light sources, the most common ones are either a flash or a continuous LED light. Both flashes and continuous lights can come in all sorts of different shapes, sizes, and intensities. However, most of the time, they're going to either be on the camera itself as an extension, or they're going to be off camera on a dedicated light stand so that it's able to be angled and moved around to achieve a particular look. In the case of continuous lights, these are usually the most common as they allow for real-time preview of what the light will look like on your model, and that allows you to shape the light and adjust your exposure a lot easier. They're also the only type of artificial light source that's able to be really used with video too, for obvious reasons. In terms of a purchase decision, sometimes you can buy dedicated continuous lights that are really big and have fans and what have you, like a lot of the stuff from a lighting brand called Aperture that is fairly well known. And then there are also LED panels which are thin and have a larger surface area, usually at the expense of light power or intensity. Now, whatever type of light source you buy is completely up to you and your budget and the amount of space you have in your given scenario and your setup and all those kind of things. So do your research. There's a lot of options to choose from. However, that's only half of the equation. The other half is what you're going to do with that light to make it a little bit more usable. And for that, we have light modifiers. Light modifiers serve as a way to make the intensity of the available light more diffuse, larger and softer. A common type of light modifier is an umbrella. Now, these umbrellas can be shot in different orientations. They can be black and have a reflective inside where the reflection is facing the subject, but because the umbrella is so large, the light will be much more diffuse. However, they could also be white and see-through and can effectively be shot through, so the light goes through the umbrella so that the top side of the umbrella faces the subject. And again, because it's such a larger light source, the entire quality of light will be a lot softer and a lot gentler. Another common light modifier is a softbox. A softbox is a modifier that you place in front of the light source and it acts as a kind of barrier for the light to shine through. Inside of the softbox is usually a lot of reflective material, and there's usually 1 or 2 sheets of diffusion panels in the front of the softbox for the actual light to pass through. Again, because the surface area of the actual softbox itself is so large, the light that comes out is significantly more diffuse than the original light source itself. Alternatively, with light modifiers, we can go the either way as well. So instead of diffusing the light and making it soft, we could also focus the light down and make it more concentrated and harsh. There are a lot of different light modifiers we can use for those purposes, especially for more creative purposes as well. Items like barn doors or snoots, when placed around the light source, will direct and focus the light into a very hard and singular area. And this can be really handy for more stylistic and creative shots, or even if you're doing product shots, but you want the light to come from a very hard, very specific direction. There's really modifiers for all sorts of different reasons, but the basic idea is that you have a light source and then you have a light modifier in order to then shape that into whatever kind of light that you want. Now, of course, when it comes to light sources and light modifiers, you don't have to go for the most expensive things. Like all things in photography, there are many different products for many different budgets at many different price ranges, and there's certainly a point of diminishing returns when it comes to all of this stuff. For me, I've just bought some stuff off Amazon, and that's not the top of the range aperture gear or anything like that, and it's gotten me this far so far. So it's totally up to you how much you want to spend on this kind of stuff. Where the money aspect really comes into play in portraiture, though, is in the camera gear itself. And oftentimes, portrait photographers really want to have the shallowest depth of field possible, and for that, you can't really get away from spending the top tier kind of money because that's the kind of gear that will take you there, unfortunately. Now, keep in mind that this isn't to say that you'll take bad portraits with an average or a normal or a decent amount of depth of field. You can take great portraits with any depth of field. Depth of field doesn't determine whether a portrait is good or bad. I'm just saying that at the higher end, portrait photographers typically want a very shallow depth of field, and in order to do so, you really have to pay for it, unfortunately. There's no real other way around it and no real sustainable, cheap ways to do so. Physics are physics. Outside of gear, shallow depth of field can be achieved by moving closer to your subject. The closer to your subject you are, especially if you're near the minimum focusing distance of your lens, the shallower your depth of field is going to end up being. And we know this already. For our gear, however, typically shallow depth of field can be achieved in 3 different ways: sensor size, aperture, and focal length. For sensor size, it's not specifically the size of the sensor itself that changes the depth of field, but it's more so that the larger the sensor you have, the bigger your available composition becomes, the bigger the field of view becomes, therefore allowing you to get closer to the subject because of the increased field of view, or using a more zoomed in lens in order to achieve the same field of view in a smaller sensor. Remember back at the start of the course when I explained about crop factors and centers? This is where it comes into play. As a bit of a refresher, if I was using an APS-C camera with an APS-C 75mm lens, and I also had a full frame body with a full frame 75mm lens, and I put them next to each other, the APS-C setup would actually be more zoomed in terms of field of view. It would actually look like 112.5mm in full frame terms. The field of view will be different, 1.5 times different. What this means from a shallow depth of field perspective is that in order to match the same field of view, we can take the APS-C camera and keep walking back to match the field of view of the full frame setup, or we can put a 112.5mm lens on the full frame to then match the same field of view. In both scenarios, the full frame will end up having more equivalent shallow depth of field, because if you move things further back, you also increase depth of field rather than decrease it. And if you use more telephoto lenses, you also decrease your depth of field as well. So in both ways, the full frame wins. So when it comes to a purchase decision, full frame is going to allow you to have the widest field of view and therefore the most potential for shallow depth of field. But full frame sensors also come with full frame prices. And while most photographers will start out with APS-C cameras, I would encourage you to make sure that if you do start out on APS-C, that you purchase a full frame lens so that you can use that full frame on your APS-C cameras, and then when you make the jump to full frame, you can get that full field of view with no crop factor. Also, as a side note, I know that this idea of full frame, APS-C, crop factor, and all this kind of stuff can be really confusing, because honestly, it really is. So if you are struggling with it, then go slow, rewatch some of the classes, or check out some YouTube videos on it. And if you're still stuck, then feel free to leave some questions or thinking about it in the comments, and I'll do my best to get back to you on it. Shallow depth of field can be most commonly affected by aperture. As you've probably figured out by now, the smaller the aperture number, the larger the hole at the end of the lens, which also means the more light that can potentially get through that, but also the shallower the depth of field naturally becomes as well. Now at the top end, prime lenses that have apertures like f1.4 are typically the largest apertures that money can buy nowadays. Sometimes some lenses can go to f1.2, which is great, and other times they can even go to f0.95, or those tend to be manual lenses at 50mm. But either way, if you were to shoot using the same body, same focal length, same distance, except one is shot at f1.4 and the other is shot at f2.8, you will be able to see a very visible, noticeable difference in terms of how shallow the depth of field can become. That being said, when it comes to purchase decisions, a fast 1.4 prime lens is usually going to be cheaper than a f2.8 zoom lens. So there's always that to consider as a purchase decision. At the start of your photography journey, especially in your first few years, I would encourage you to work exclusively with zooms until you absolutely need primes, because it does take quite a lot of time to distinguish what focal lengths you really love to work with and what genres of photography you like to use them in. Then from there, diving into primes for that genre will elevate your work for sure, but it's not like doing it without a shallow depth of field makes it bad. The zoom will still get you 85-90% of the way there. A fast prime will just take you the rest of the way. And then finally, there's focal length. When it comes to focal length, the longer or the more telephoto your focal length, the shallower your depth of field becomes, all other things being equal. If we were to line up a 35mm shot and a 200mm shot with exactly the same composition and proportion and aperture, you would see that the background on the 200mm shot is far more blurry. However, shooting a portrait at 200mm is really not practical at all. Trust me, I've tried. So finding that balance of what focal length is right for you is important. You want one that is close enough to the model so that you can talk to them and build rapport and direct them, but also one that is useful enough for you to fill the frame in a way that you want to, and then also one that has a good amount of shallow depth of field that you can work with. For me, that's anywhere between 24 and a maximum of 85, but that's just me. I know a lot of people who swear by 135, and I know a lot of people who only stick to just 50, but to each their own. Find what works for you, but then when it comes to making a purchase decision, use those focal lengths exclusively on a zoom lens first before you go and buy a prime lens of that focal length, just so that you know whether or not you'll like it. All right, so finally for gear, we have autofocus. So again, when we take pictures, we shake the camera. And in portraiture, people move. And there are so many different variables that change all of the time. And the more that we can get our gear to work for us, the better. It's so incredibly hard to shoot shallow depth of field portraits with a manual focus lens. And you'll note that I specified shallow depth of field. It's easy enough with a deeper depth of field like it is in street photography and zone focusing. However, in portraiture, we really do want that shallow depth of field as often as we can. So having a autofocus system that keeps up with what we want to do can be important. And while most modern cameras are pretty good at autofocus these days, you'll find that the full frame stuff is definitely the best at it, followed by the APS-C stuff and the MFT stuff, the 1-inch stuff, and so on. Specifically, purchasing a camera body that has eye autofocus capabilities will save you a lot of headache and heartache, trust me. And this is one of those things where modern innovation really trumps what we used to have in the old days. And nowadays, we have technology where you can eye focus lock onto your subject, and even if they look away or they go out of frame and they come back, as soon as their eyes come back into the composition, they're able to grab focus again. It's truly amazing, and I highly recommend it, especially if you are endeavoring on portraiture in a little bit more of a serious way. Now, just a little bit of a side note, sometimes depending on your setup and your manufacturer and all that kind of stuff, your lens choice can also have a minor role in how fast your autofocus manages to keep up as well. You know, the older, bigger lenses have older technologies inside them that they just don't move glass around as fast as the newer stuff. That's just how it is. The new tech moves big glass faster. It's not a huge determiner, as even autofocus lenses from 5 years ago can perform pretty well in most cases, but if you are looking for the pinnacle of the pinnacle, then that's just something to consider. All right, now for the fun part. Let's talk about techniques that are specific to portraiture. Now, just like in other genres that we covered, some of these techniques aren't strictly hard techniques that are specifically camera related. In fact, the majority of this section is actually going to cover more soft techniques that you really do need for good portraiture. All right, let's dive in. All right, we'll start with one of the most asked questions that I get when it comes to portraits. How do you find models to shoot? Because a portrait isn't really a portrait if there's no person to shoot, right? Well, when it comes to shooting with models, there are actually two kinds of ways that you can do it. You can do a page shoot, or you can do what's called a TFP shoot, so a time for photos shoot. I'd say that paying a model to shoot is always a lot easier because the money is the incentive to shoot, and therefore your experience doesn't matter as much. And in this case, it's as simple as finding a model you want to shoot, probably on Instagram, and then DMing them to see if they're available for a paid shoot, and then asking them what their rates are. If you've got zero experience doing portraits, then that's totally fine. This is actually one of the best ways for you to get experience, in my opinion. Just try to pay for an hour or two max, and then let the model know that you're new beforehand. Now, the great thing about professional models is that, well, they're models and it's a job, and the more experienced ones have lots of poses in their repertoire, so you don't need to tell them how to pose because they'll know what their angles are and all that kind of stuff. And we'll cover more about poses in the next section. Now, the second way you can find a model is to do a TFP shoot. And doing time for photos means that it's very much a collaboration between you and the model. they're exchanging their time for you to deliver them photos so that they could use those photos for themselves as well. Perhaps it's for their portfolios or for them to post on Instagram or whatever the case may be. With TFP, delivering usable, high quality photos to the model is very much implied, whereas for paid work, it's not. Of course, in both cases, models will love if, they've got something to show for it. So if you're feeling nice on a paid shoot, then, that's something to consider as well. But the thing with TFP is that the model is relying on the photographer to deliver images that they can use. And depending on how experienced they are, they may or may not be used to a certain caliber of resulting work. And this is where things can get a little bit difficult. So if you approach a model with zero portfolio to show for yourself, then it's very unlikely that someone will take the chance on you because they don't really know what return they're going to get for their time when it comes to the images that they will hopefully eventually receive. Remember that they're giving up their time to be able to shoot with you, and they of course want photos that they can use. Now, this is a totally natural human reaction, and if you just so happen to have an experience that's anything that's not this, and you reach out to a model and a model is randomly just going to go out of their way to shoot with you and it's your first time, then you are extremely lucky. Now, this is why it's usually a great idea to start to try to build up a portfolio of portraits that you can use first before trying to get someone to do TFP with you. And that way, not only will you get practice doing shoots, but you'll also have something to show for it. And, the people that you approach will be able to then trust you when you're approaching them for TFP. Now, of course, at the start, this can be hard, but there are two main ways that you can start to build up a portfolio of images at the beginning. And the first way is to do paid shoots and use those images as part of your portfolio. And the second way is to then coerce your friends and family to shoot with you. And even if your friends and family aren't models, that doesn't mean that they're all camera shy. Chances are you'll be able to get at least one or two of your friends who has, even a partner to take a few shots with you, because doing couple shoots for them will give you good practice as well to see, what you can do with whoever is around you. And then once you start to build a portfolio, make sure to put it somewhere on the internet where you can share it. And then when you approach models that you want to approach for TFP, then make sure to show them that you also shoot portraits and that you have a portfolio that's worthy of their time. All right, so I'll throw this little thing in here for male portrait photographers out there who have no portfolio. Here's a very hard reality for you. The entire portraiture industry is filled with creeps. And female models especially will not only have to deal with the everyday drag of getting hit on by dudes left, right, and center, but they will have to face it at work as well. And in some cases, trying to approach a model, especially an experienced one with zero portfolio, can make you look like a creep with bad intentions, and it's a surefire way to get ignored. Because there's a lot of creepy, slimy behavior when it comes to models and photographers, so try to do your best to avoid all of that and build a serious, reputable portfolio that you're proud to show off. Alrighty, let's talk about posing now. When it comes to posing, there's really one main question you need to ask that usually branches off into two different use cases. And the question is the person a professional model or not? Now, if the person is a professional model, they'll have an entire repertoire of poses that they will cycle through for a given scene or a scenario. And the good ones will be able to be very conscious of how they look under certain lighting conditions and will even suggest places and locations for you to go to. They'll know exactly how they look and what poses look most flattering to them in different scenarios. So trust them. They know their bodies better than you do, and because they're pros, they would have been in hundreds of shoots and have seen those poses that work best for them. In this case, it's your job to direct them if you have something specific that you want, for sure, but it's more likely going to be your job to just ensure that there's nothing wrong with their outfit or their hair or their makeup or any kind of weird lighting or anything else that they can't see. Having a really good professional model helps a lot, trust me, especially for your first dozen shoots or so. Having someone else who already knows the ropes allows you to learn off them while you're also learning as well. It is a huge bonus and a massive time saver. Okay, so what if the person is not a professional model? What if they're a new model, or what if they're not a model at all and they're just a friend or a family member with absolutely zero experience? Well, then it's all on you. And the way to be able to manage this is to learn the poses for yourself so that you can then direct them to do the poses in the way that you want them to do it. And yes, that means you dudes out there, you got to learn female poses, which are definitely different to male model poses. The same goes for you females out there shooting male models. You got to learn the male moves as well. Now, the best way that I've found to do this is to watch shows like America's Next Top Model or any other shows that have modeling or posing in them. Watch these shows and watch the models pose in front of cameras or down the catwalk. Pause when they make a pose and then screenshot it, and then develop a little board of poses that you can refer back to. And then when you have time, do those poses for yourself. Literally strike the pose for yourself in front of a mirror and see how you look. And I know this sounds really silly, but I assure you, putting yourself in the shoes of the person that you want to shoot makes things tremendously easier on everyone, especially if that person hasn't seen the pose that you're trying to instruct them to do. And once you memorize all of these different poses, you can then show your inexperienced model or friend or family member the exact pose that you want them to do in the exact way that you want them to do it. I mean, even if you're working with a professional model, you can still communicate with them to do a particular pose that you think might look great for that situation that you're in. This is immensely helpful knowledge that you can also get a good laugh out of. Some things to be attentive to when you are analyzing how people pose are things that look flattering to the model and in the lighting that they're in as well. For example, for females, arms pressed up against the body makes the arms look fatter and unflattering. Or when the hands are on the hips, turning them so that the fingers are facing downwards, not upwards, supinates the bicep, and it makes the arms look thinner and leaner than if they were to be turned upwards and pronated. Under most lighting conditions, you want your models to stretch up their neck and tilt their chin downwards so that the shape of the jawline is accentuated and it gives a lot of shape and shadow to the face. For males, poses with one arm behind the head are an easy way to look natural but show off the arms in a very casual way. For a more masculine pose, cross the arms, but be aware about the shape that the pecs will make if the arms are pressed too hard on the body. Depending on the shape of the pec, some pecs are a little bit more fat than shapely and can look less flattering than more flattering. Dynamic poses are great for both females and males, but many males find moving poses significantly more natural and easier to grasp, especially for the inexperienced. Simply pretending to take one step or pretending to fiddle with your watch or, doing up a button or something like that is an easy way to get experienced people to do natural poses. And there's a lot of stuff like this that is an entire course in and of itself, but you'll learn a tremendous amount by just watching a few episodes of modeling shows, I promise. Now, regardless of whether you have a professional model or you somehow convinced your mother, a portrait shoot can be intimidating. And especially if the goal is to bring out certain emotions in a person, that person needs to feel relaxed with you so that you can allow them to feel comfortable showing a broader range of emotion naturally. Now, a great way to do this is to just have a coffee before you shoot and just chat and get the vibe going. Keep things light and playful with lots of laughs and smiles. When you're shooting, when you're moving in between locations, or when there's a little bit of a down period, get to know them as a person and allow them to know you as well. Now, of course, there are professional models who just want to go in hard and fast, and now it's strictly your business with no warm-up, but most people will want to be treated like normal people and eased into things. So that's what I recommend. It gets easier if you work with the same people over and over and over again because rapport builds up over time. And eventually, especially with professional models, you get to the point where you know exactly what they'll be doing in a new location and you'll be able to work super synergistically with them. And this is really magical when it happens, I assure you. Something that's related to building rapport is learning how to direct and give feedback properly. Remember, there's a person at the other end of the lens as well. And even if you paid them, they're not just a puppet for you to boss around or be mean to. They're not an object. And I see people make this mistake all the time and forget to care about the other person. So be kind. When you're taking shots and they're doing a pose that you like, give them positive reinforcement and let them know that they're doing a good job. Saying things like, "Oh, that's a great pose. I love that. Can we hold that for a second? I just want a couple more." Or, "I love the way your pose looks in this light." Or even something small like, "Yeah, that's great. I love it. Love that pose," can really help the vibe of you working together and increase the overall success of the portrait shoot. This is in effect giving the model feedback. Remember, they're not a mind reader. If you like a pose that they do, you have to let them know. And if you don't like a pose, you don't specifically need to tell them, but reinforcing the positive will let them know what to do next. What I like to do as well is after a brief burst at a specific location, I actually show the model the images that I took in the back of the camera really quickly. And I'll do this at least once every 15 minutes if we haven't moved location. But the intention here is to bring them into the process as much as possible. By showing them the images in real time and reviewing the shots together as you go, you can both understand which shots you like, which styles, which lighting, what poses you like, and the model can also do some quick checks to see if their outfit is still the way that it's meant to be, or that their hair and their makeup is still good, or all that kind of stuff. Bringing them into the process in this way is really helpful for everyone. When it comes to actually giving directions while shooting, and this might sound like a small thing, but interpersonal skills matter. Instead of saying, "Move here, do this, now do this, put your arm up, twist to the right," etc., in such a forward and demanding and hard way, I like to soften things with requests. Things like, "Can we try this?" Or, "What do you think about doing this?" Or, "I loved it when you did this. Can we try something similar?" In a portrait shoot, if you're shooting with an experienced model, you're going to be ending up making a lot of commands. So the softer they become, the smoother the process will go. Remember that portrait shoots are always a collaboration of two people, and the end result is going to be determined by how well both of you worked together at the end of the day. So be kind, be gentle, and be patient. In portraiture, there are quite a few things that require organization. And I'll try to list these out pretty rapid fire because today's lesson is already way long enough. But I think all of these things are worth thinking about ahead of time, and ensuring that you have them covered will ensure that you have a very smooth shoot. Know the exact shoot location, date, and time. Knowing how many locations or what path you're going to take, how long it's going to take to transit between each one, what time of day it is, what kind of light it is if it's outside, all of the logistics behind traveling from one location to the next. Making sure that you have a specific start and end time is really important. And there's nothing worse than being roped into something that you don't know the end of. So plan ahead. Travel. If you have to travel to and from locations, then, consider the logistics of how you're going to get there. Are you going to drive? Do you need to hire a car? Are you going to take public transport? If you're asking the model to come and meet you somewhere, especially if it's far, then it's also worth covering their expenses of travel, of getting to that location as well. Location costs. Organizing things like studio hire if you're hiring a studio, or location hire if it's a specific destination that requires booking. And then considering things like permits and all that kind of stuff is really important to organize beforehand. And there's nothing worse than booking a model, getting their outfit and makeup done, and then beginning a shoot and then being stopped midway by some ranger because you forgot to, get their permission, or, forgot to pay location fees or something like that. Weather. If you're shooting outside or even indoors using natural light, figure out the weather and what time is suitable to suit. Especially the case if you want to shoot in bright light or specifically an overcast situation, it's definitely worth looking up the weather before you go. Breaks. If your shoot is long and it goes for a fair amount of time, you may want to schedule in breaks for food or for rest, because shooting for many, many hours in a row can be very tiring. Scheduling in breaks means that both you and the model will be charged up and all ready to go. Outfit and makeup. If you have a requirement for outfit and makeup, make sure to organize and communicate that first and foremost. This in some cases can require a lot more planning than you expect, especially if the model doesn't own what you're looking for and has to hire out outfits and such. Also, if they're not doing their own makeup, then you'll have to organize a makeup artist as well as a place for them to prepare as well. Just keep all of those different logistics in mind. Lighting and gear. If you're shooting in studio or outside or inside using artificial lights or using natural lights, all of these situations all require different gear and different lighting. And knowing whether you have to pay for lighting or bringing your own is important, as well as bringing the right camera gear as well. Think about the right amount of gear to bring. Too little and you don't get the shot that you're looking for, and too much and you end up bringing all this gear that you don't use. Try to envision the catalog of shots in your mind that you want to get ahead of time and bring the gear that will be able to best capture that. Alrighty, that was another long lesson, huh? 3 in a row. Don't worry, tomorrow's lesson won't be as long as the last 3 days, but I do hope that it will be just as interesting. Now, to finish up with today, let's round up some TLDRs and some quick tips. So, portraiture is all about taking photos of people. However, the purpose for that could be many things. It could be a commercial, it could be headshots, it could be fashion, makeup, hair, high key art. It could be about emotion and expression and understanding. It could be in magazines, it could be in ads, it could be in websites, social media, it could be all over the place. The variety and the subgenres of portraiture are tremendous, but ultimately, it's all about people. Portraiture, to this end, is perhaps the most human interaction that you'll find out of any genre of photography, and as such, there are a lot of interpersonal soft skills that are required to really get the best out of a given shoot. Soft skills like building rapport, making the other person feel comfortable, giving feedback in a comfortable way as well. Anything to do with communication with the other person are all really important things to making the most out of your time together. Finding someone to take photos of, whether they are a professional model or friends and family, have different approaches to the things that you need to be aware of. Professionals know what they're doing already, and you can pay for their time and their experience in the field. A friend or a family member who doesn't know poses requires direction, and you can start to understand how to direct them by learning the poses and doing them yourself. You can do this by watching shows like America's Top Model, or jumping on YouTube and watching models go up and down the catwalk, or finding a posing tutorial. There are so many different poses out there, and really for models, it's all about creativity and your imagination. If you want to do TFP or time for photos with a model, then make sure you have some work to be able to show them that you can do it in the first place. You need to reassure them that by the end of the shoot, they'll have something that they can show for it and be able to use for themselves. You can start to build a portfolio initially by hiring models or getting your friends and family to help take images with you. Studio shooting is very different to natural light shooting. In a studio setting, you need to worry about things like artificial lighting, whether or not you're going to use flashes or continuous lights, set design, props, outfits, and so on. With natural light shooting, you have to worry about the weather, the time of day, adapting to the light that you can't control, also making sure that the model is comfortable in their outfit at the time of day and at the time of year. This is really important as well. There are many different types of lighting styles that can be used both in artificial and natural lighting scenarios. Light placement and light direction is the biggest thing that determines what style of lighting you're going for and therefore what kind of mood the image will have. Also, different techniques are also extremely flattering for some people, like loop lighting, whereas other techniques like flat or butterfly lighting may or may not be flattering to some people depending on their facial structure. You just have to try it out and see. To finish, remember that portraiture, regardless of what purpose you're doing it for, will only ever be as good as the connection you have with the person that you're shooting with. And while there's definitely a practical, tactical, hard craft side to it in terms of settings and lighting, there's also a soft craft side to it as well, because after all, you're collaborating with another human. Alrighty, another long day of learning about the most common photography genres, but that's it for this little series of deep dives on the popular photography genres. For now, for today's assignment, we're going to, you guessed it, plan for a portraiture shoot. Yay! So, we talked about paid TFP and using your friends for your first shoots, but I'm going to assume that you don't already have a portfolio, so TFP is kind of out of the question. So whether you want to spend money on a paid shoot or not is totally up to you, but if you don't want to, then tap a friend on the shoulder and see if they'll come and shoot with you, and then take them out to dinner or something to say thank you. So, organize your first portrait shoot with someone. It doesn't have to be crazy. You don't need to have specific clothes or specific outfits or makeup or a special location or anything like that, although you most certainly can if you want to. But the idea is just to have a casual shoot and start to get some experience under your belt and start to build up that portfolio. So, this process means that you'll have to find the person to shoot. You'll have to make sure that you know what you're doing in terms of poses and instructions. You'll have to research a location to shoot. You'll have to organize the time of day and how long the shoot is going for. And then you're going to have to jump right into the deep end and see how you go. Rewatch the section about organization for things to consider before you go off and shoot. All right, good luck. I'm jealous. I remember my first portrait shoot, and it was with one of my best friends, and we had a blast. So good times. All right, I'll see you tomorrow.